Imperial yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kvike hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Making beer is a complex process. Or is it? You take some malted grain, add some water, you get wort and yeast that's present everywhere, then ferments it into beer. And as our understanding of the world improves, so too does our understanding of the scientific processes that make the world work. Enzymes are a crucial part of that process. I'm your host, Cade, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode where I talked to Alexander Mertz and Simon Carlson of Novonesis about creative uses of enzymes.
You know, maybe 100 episodes, we ended up having a conversation about enzymes. And in that one, we broke down the differences between endogenous and exogenous enzymes. And, you know, when you mash a beer, the malt have these kind of inherent enzyme packages inside of them, and those are the endogenous ones. But what you guys really dove into were these exogenous ones that are made in a lab that you can add to your beer. And, you know, I kind of think of them as kind of cheat codes. And using these scientific tools at our fingertips, we can make really incredible beers that resolve a lot of the issues that might be inherent within the endogenous ones that we're historically limited to. Part of me is like, well, it's kind of cheating. You know, we should be, you know, Reinheitsgebot or bust. But then another part of me is like, you can make really incredible beers that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. And so I've really come around, and I use enzymes in a lot of my beers and find that they can really help solve a lot of problems in the brew house.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and cheat codes is a great way to talk about them. I think that's a fantastic way, right? They are kind of like cheat codes. But for me, I always thought of enzymes as problem solvers, right? They're the things that you do when something goes wrong. Like, crap, I've got a stuck sparge. Let me add some enzymes in this and see if I can get it out. Oh, crap, I can't brew this beer. Oh, I've got a diacetyl issue. Maybe add some enzyme and see if I can get rid of some of that, right? I always see them as problem solvers. But one of the things that struck me in my conversation last week was when Alex mentioned that you could brew a beer from entirely unmalted grains with the use of enzymes. And that really struck me on the head. Is like, wait a minute, we don't have to use malted barley. We could use unmalted barley or rice or rye or anything. That means I could brew from any starch anywhere. And that sort of, more than like the novelty of being able to use like other starches, because I like barley and I think it's great. I don't necessarily need to expand to other starches, but it flipped something in for me in the way that I think about enzymes as I approach brewing. And I often think of, like I said, exogenous enzymes as problem solvers, but they're tools. They're cheat codes, as you just said, in the same way that you might use like calcium sulfate or acid to hit a particular water profile or to hit a particular pH during the mash. By the way, you're hitting that pH because of enzymes. Why not add exogenous enzymes? Why not? Why are we beholden to the Reinheitsgebot of like no process additions? We live in a modern world and we can make amazing styles and amazing new beers by using enzymes. So yeah, I was pretty excited last week whenever talking to Simon and Alex, and I'm pretty excited to hear how you use enzymes, Jordan, but also talk about maybe expanding our creativity, right? Talk about like styles that we might not have otherwise been able to brew, but for adding exogenous enzymes, and maybe sort of move away from this idea that we're only stuck with those enzymes that are in malted barley. So I'm pretty excited to talk about this episode. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, it'd be really cool. Take a minute to support us. Go to patreon.com/Brülosophy and take a look at all the different contribution levels. You can choose from different awards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and get an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. It's only a few bucks a month, and it does help us continue doing what we're doing here at Brülosophy from the Brülosophy.com website, this podcast, the Brülosophy podcast and the Brülosophy show on YouTube. And if you're interested in the live Q&A, this month's guest is my friend and colleague, Dr. Scott LaFontaine. You'll probably recognize him from doing the initial research on dry hop saturation points and also from his more recent research on rice malt from several episodes back on the Brew Lab. Scott is one of the brightest up-and-coming brewing scholars, and you're really going to want to be able to pick his brain. I mean, I'm serious. This guy could be the next Tom Shellhammer. So you don't want to miss him. Now's the time. And of course, all you have to do is pause the show, head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy to sign up. We've got such an active group of Brülosophy followers, and whether it's on the website and YouTube channel, people who email in feedback, or folks who share and discuss our results, it's rewarding and really humbling for us to hear from you. So I just, again, want to say thank you for engaging with us. Thank you for listening to the show, and thank you for consuming the information that we put out there. If you haven't yet left us a comment or a review or sent in an email, I'd love to hear from you. My email is cade@brülosophy.com, or you can leave a comment or review of the show wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. For feedback this week, listener John wrote in about episode 172, where we discussed our favorite yeast strains. He says, I loved this most recent Applying the Science episode on favorite yeast strains. I just wanted to see what you and Jordan thought about some information I found from Fermentis on 3470 relative to fermentation temperature and varied gravity worts and the resulting sensory data. It appears in their graphs that it produces very similar fermentation characteristics across a range of temperatures, with the only trial that had more off flavors being the low pitch rate and cool fermentation temperature trial. Anyways, I love the show, and it's my favorite podcast, along with the Brülosophy podcast, to listen to on my hour-long commute. Jordan, what do you think? 3470 at different temperatures, pitch rates, all that stuff.
Yeah, this is something I've definitely played around with a lot, and I'm really enjoying using 3470 as both a cold fermented lager strain for maybe like a German Pilsner, and then so I might ferment that at like 47 degree F, and then I like to do a tasty schedule, so then slowly ramping up to like 52, 57, and then a diacetyl rest. And then also on the ale side, I'll use 3470 as my house ale strain and make IPAs, even something like a Kolsch, fermenting like 60. I think that the, warmer fermentation creates a really crisp and clean beer that work, I think, really well in drier styles like Kolsch and West Coast IPA. I think that, if you have the ability to ferment it cold when you're making a traditional German lager, why not? But you can clearly make a really good crisp beer at elevated temperatures with this strain. And this data only really demonstrates the proof is in the pudding there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you mentioned all that on the show too, and I think that's exactly right. It's cool to see it generated in some data from Lallemand themselves, right? I mean, you were talking about it, like different fermentation temperatures, different gravities of wort, like all this different stuff, different pitch rates. It's a really robust yeast. Like I said, my only complaint about it is that I find it often is hard to flocculate out for me. And you didn't have that issue, right? And so, those are personal experiences that we have in different ways. But yeah, it's a really robust yeast. I think that's one of the reasons why it is probably, if not the most popular yeast strain in the world, it's definitely up there, right? It's going to be in anybody's top 5. And so, yeah, John, thanks for sending in this information. It is really cool to see this. By the way, just to sort of like quickly summarize the information that he sent in, Lallemand did gravities from like 1048 all the way up to 1080, and pitched this at from like 100 million cells per mil per degree Plato, up to like 200 million cells, and even down to 25 million cells per mil per degree Plato, which is pretty cool. And they had all this information that basically showed, lower pitch rates resulted in longer fermentation time, but the sensory characteristics were basically the same, and attenuations were pretty similar, although there was a little bit of difference in attenuation, especially at those higher gravities, right? Because it just didn't get down all the way to the fermentation profiles that like the lower gravity normal fermentation got to. But anyway, that's just sort of a quick summary. Pretty robust yeast. It may perform a little bit differently for you at different temperatures and gravities and pitch rates, but it seems pretty robust. So yeah, John, thanks for sending this in and sending that as feedback. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about creative uses of enzymes. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Early holiday deals are here, and so are amazing deals at Amazon. You'll save so much on early holiday gifts for the home, like vacuums, bedding, and home decor. You'll have money left over for that ergonomic recliner to catch up on reading. Or falling asleep while reading. Or those gingerbread scented candles that help with the illusion that you made the dessert yourself. Oh, what fun it is to save. Shop early holiday deals now.
Got great ideas, but no idea how to build a website? Get Bluehost. Their AI design tool creates high-quality WordPress sites super fast. Whether you're a blogger, influencer, or launching a side hustle, Bluehost helps boost your growth with built-in marketing and e-commerce tools. Upgrade to cloud and get 100% uptime and 24/7 security to stay online all the time. Why wait? You've got the vision. Make it real. Visit Bluehost.com to get started.
It took me several episodes before I made this connection, but the malting process is mostly about generating the enzyme package that brewers need to make wort for beer, at least whenever you're using base malts. It's kind of embarrassingly, I'd said several episodes, but it probably took me like 50 to 60 episodes before I started thinking about malting as, partially about flavor. But the main thing is it's about enzymes. It's about generating those endogenous enzymes into malted barley that we can use for beer. And that's basically the difference between malted and unmalted barley, right? Is that enzyme package.
Well, but again, there's got to be some sort of flavor characteristic, right? Because the longer we kiln something in the malting process, the more, caramely and then into roasty flavors you could get. And so even when talking about this idea of a beer that uses exogenous enzymes with 100% unmalted barley, surely that would taste different.
Well, right? I guess it would depend. What if you kilned that all malted barley first, right? What if you dried it or roasted it or kilned it and didn't have to worry about the enzyme package? Because you're totally right? Because flavor, I think, is the second most important thing for malting, right? And I mean, there's a reason why we have all these different types of malted barley. But the difference between like a Pils malt and like a Munich 10 or a Munich 20, there's flavor and color differences, which are important to the beer, but they also lose their enzyme power, right? They lose their diastatic power. What if you could totally ignore the enzyme power and just kiln either unmalted barley or malted barley, but let's say kiln unmalted barley to the same, flavor characteristics, or even a wider, more diverse range of characteristics, because you don't have to worry about the enzyme package, right? If you were able to just, have a lightly kilned unmalted barley for a Pilsner, or for an American light lager, or for an international pale lager or something like that doesn't have a huge malt characteristic, and then you were able to just add enzymes to it to make it ferment, that might produce an interestingly characterful beer, right? You might be able to do something like, I don't know, a new style that we don't normally think of. It would be sort of like an unmalted barley adjunct beer.
Well, I've experienced this recently, right, with heavy Munich-based lagers that they just don't ferment as well. And at the end of the finishing gravity, I'm like, I wish I'd used some enzyme to just dry that out a little bit, because I don't think that it's an absolute effect, right? It's not like if you add enzyme, you're always going to go to X. It's got to. My guess is it would be relative to the amount of enzymatic power that already exists in your wort or whatever. But does that mean that you could make a 1050 to 1010 FG black lager or something using 100% roasted black patent malt if you used enzyme?
I mean, I don't know that you would want to put 100% black patent.
No, I know. But for argument's sake, would it ferment?
The thing about it with black patent malt is probably the sugars are probably gone, right? The starches are probably burned off and gone. But could you do it with unmalted barley? Could you do a Guinness recipe, right, with the 5% of black patent malt or whatever, roasted barley, and then 95% unmalted barley with exogenous enzymes? Yeah, I think you could do that. Could you do it with I don't know, an interesting question, could you do it with crystal, right? If you fermented 100% with crystal, there's sugar that's already caramelized in there, right? But could you use some sort of, no, you couldn't, because it's already fixed in that crystalline structure. The point here of the enzymes would be to access a starch that's still available that we don't normally think about. And an example might be rye, right? And because if you brew with rye and add barley malt to it, you're going to get the enzymes. There will be enough enzymes from malted barley to get access to those rye. But the rye has a wildly different percentage of glucans and xylans that are going to stick and gum up your mash, right? And so if you tried to do 100% rye IPA, for example, right, that would not be very feasible for most brewers. It's basically just going to make a porridge, right? Your wort is going to be a thick slurry. You're not going to be able to get off much of your sugar, and your efficiency is going to be basically zero because you're just not getting anything out of that mash. So I think using a black patent malt, I don't know that that's probably going to be. Maybe. I mean, I don't think so. I just don't think there's enough starch left. But using something like rye, you could. And rye, remember, is a pretty neutral grain. People always say rye tastes like cardamom, but I think that's just because they eat too much rye bread, which has cardamom in it generally. I've never had that experience that rye tastes like spicy or like cardamom.
Yeah, I mean... when it comes to brewing with rye, regardless of whatever flavor it produces, the concern that you're describing here, is it just a lautering issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can get access to starches or access to starch to convert into sugar is what I mean, right? But I think, yeah, you have a problem getting it out of the mash tun. That's a big issue. I've brewed with rye before and I didn't have any problem sparging, but the rye was at like 10% of the grain bill, right? So like a very small amount and basically just a body addition, right? I just wanted a little bit of body from the rye whenever I did that rye IPA. And I've seen recipes up to like 20 or 30%, but all over I've never tried to brew with rye above 30%, but everywhere I've heard, if you go over like 30% rye, you're basically just not going to get your wort out of the mash tun.
Right. So the point being is that the rye is self-converting, right? That you could, in theory, do 100% rye in a world where you could effectively lauter it, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I don't know if rye is malted first, right? Because again, the malting process is what generates enzymes. But with a portion of barley, which is generally how rye is used, you could have enough enzymes from the malted barley to convert the rye. But in this case, you could make 100% rye without even worrying if it's malted or not with the use of enzymes, with amylase enzyme, glucanase, and amyloglucosidase, all that sort of stuff. If you mix that suite of enzymes together, you wouldn't have to care if it was malted or not, or if it had enough enzymes. You just add the enzymes right in and make 100% malted beer or 100% rye beer.
Right. So they do make malted rye. So my guess is that would self-convert. But like you mentioned, that lautering be a problem. I think there's a couple non-enzyme solutions that are at the homebrew scale. One would be rice hulls. Maybe 50% rice hulls or something would be enough for it to effectively lauter. But two, what about brewing a bag? Does it care? Or would it still be an impossible beer to make without some sort of glucose whatever enzyme to break it up? Would brewing a bag be okay on its own with just rye?
A glucanase or something. I don't know. I've never tried to brew in a bag with rye. I would still imagine, though, it's still just... The problem is everything's going to be stuck together. And so if you remember back, I don't know if you do remember back, But there was an episode where we talked about like glucanases in beer and what their purpose was. And it's sort of like unwrapping the package of a present, right? There's wrapping paper on the outside, and then there's all of the cardboard and all of the different packing materials and stuff, and then there's the present that's inside, right? And so you're trying to get that sugar, but all that other stuff, all the packing peanuts, all the cardboard, all the paper and everything, that stuff is sticky and gooey, and if stuff touches it, it gets stuck to it. And rye has a higher percentage of those things than barley does. So if you're using malted rye or rye itself, you have to get through all of those other packing materials to get to the starch, which is why you might need something like a beta glucanase to help you access that. And so, like, if you think about it, it'd be kind of like, you know, like oatmeal, right? You can brew with flaked oats and not have any problems. It doesn't look like oatmeal when you brew with flaked oats, right? But if you did 100% flaked oat beer, then you would just be making oatmeal, and it would be all sticky and gooey, and there wouldn't be any liquid dripping off. I think that's the image that I have, at least in my brain. I think that's how it works.
Well, the other issue with rye when you use too much is that it makes a really viscous beer. And so I've seen like videos on the internet of like high rye beers, and they pour like maple syrup. Would that be enjoyable? And would this beta glucanase enzyme, if it's assisting with lautering, viscosity, would it also result in a thinner, more normal beer?
Yeah, I think it would. I think that's what Simon was sort of hinting at in these like impossible beer styles, right? Because it's like you said, if you tried to brew with rye, you'd make a thicker, more viscous beer. And that's why I added rye to that IPA in the first place, right? As I wanted a little bit more mouthfeel to come through into the finished beer. I didn't want it as like crisp and dry. I wanted it a little bit thicker and a little more mouthfeel. I ended up really not liking that beer, by the way. Just FYI, I find I like crisp, dry IPAs now way more than I like those with a little bit thicker mouthfeel. But what about a hazy IPA? A hazy IPA that might benefit from a little bit of thicker we use oats and wheat, right, in a hazy IPA. But what if you made a 100% rye hazy IPA? That might actually be really nice. And so, yeah, you could add these enzymes and have it still come out the same sort of consistency as beer, or maybe dial in that mouthfeel a little bit more than you'd like. If you'd like it a little bit more viscous, reduce the enzyme addition a little bit. If you'd like it a little bit thinner, increase the enzyme a little bit so that, it can work on those glucanases and stuff. But this is where you can use those enzymes as tools. And to me, again, we mentioned it at the top, but I think that's one of those things that was most important to me, or a biggest takeaway from last week, is that at that point, you're trying to achieve an outcome, and we don't have a problem. It's not like we have a problem lautering or trying to fix something. It's that we're trying to achieve an outcome. I'm trying to achieve an IPA that has a particular mouthfeel and body, and I now have a different source, right? A different structure, a different starch source that I could potentially use to achieve that same profile. And that was one of those cool things. Again, like I just started thinking about enzymes as an ingredient. And I know, for example, you use fungal amylase and diacetyl in a lot of your beers. And I don't know, is it a no-brainer for you to add those to every batch, or are you still selective about when you use and add those enzymes?
Well, you said diacetyl, like I assume you mean a diacetyl reducing enzyme like ALDC?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do view these as tools in the toolkit, and if you're screwing a screw into the wall, you don't use a hammer, right? You use a screwdriver.
Yeah.
And so it depends on the style and it depends on my goals. And so if I want a dry beer, I like to use fungal alpha amylase to dry it out. But, for example, if I was making a really big barrel-aged barley wine, I'm not trying to dry that out. You want that big residual sugar amount to give you that big, sweet, full mouthfeel. And so I don't think that'd be appropriate use of that. Similarly, like with ALDC, if I'm using a yeast strain that doesn't throw off a lot of diacetyl, like a Saison yeast strain, why waste the ALDC? ALDC at the homebrew level is like $30 for a tiny little vial. And so it's actually a fairly expensive enzyme in the grand scheme of things. And so I think that, use it wisely. I'm not really concerned about Imperial's rustic throwing off diacetyl, for example.
Sure. It kind of depends on the yeast strain, right? If you're worried about the yeast strain throwing off diacetyl, then you might add ALDC. I was wondering about it too, like from a hop creep perspective. Like when you're making IPAs, are you sort of just like throwing in the ALDC, going like, I'm not going to worry about it. Even if I've got a yeast strain that doesn't typically throw diacetyl, I'm just not going to worry about it because it for whatever. So if I dry hop, I'm also going to add ALDC.
So I've been adding ALDC at yeast pitch for my IPAs. And that I would do that probably whether I was using flagship or global, just to be safe. But then, assuming I remember to do so, I will often then add a second dose of ALDC at the dry hop. And I'd asked you before if you think that was necessary, and you had suggested that in theory it shouldn't be because the ALDC would continue to work for the life cycle of the beer. But I have heard of really respected hoppy pro brewers adding it at both stages. So I figured, it's $1. It's worth the insurance. So I have been adding it twice. But there have been times that I forgot, and I've still been able to make diacetyl-free beer. And so maybe I'm just getting enough from the first edition, or maybe I'm successfully reducing it during my dry hopping phase anyway. I'm not totally sure.
Yeah. I mean, I still maintain that I think like it depends on if you have enough in the beer. The enzyme's not going anywhere because there's no kill step at the end, right? Unless you're pasteurizing, which you haven't done. So the enzyme's still there, it's still active, and it'll still help with diacetyl, unless maybe the yeast takes it up. I guess I don't know that information. Maybe the yeast takes up some of the enzyme or does something with the enzyme and converts it in a different way. I don't know. I don't actually know, but yeah, for sure, definitely extra insurance pitching it whenever you dry hop. But that's exactly what I was talking about. So like for whether you're using global or whether you're using flagship or London or whatever else that you're using for your IPA, that's kind of one of those things it almost has become a no-brainer for you to add ALDC when you're fermenting with a beer that you're going to dry hop, right? Because it just kind of makes sense. And I feel like this is kind of a shift for me and for a bunch of other brewers, because if you told me this 2 or 3 years ago, I would have been like, no, I don't use enzymes at all, except for in the mash, right? The mash I don't add exogenous enzymes to the mash, but I use enzymes that are endogenous to the barley. But otherwise, no, I don't use enzymes at all. But now, like, I feel like with ALDC and with hoppy beers, it is becoming one of those things where people are just adding it all the time. And it kind of makes sense. Like, you don't have to deal with diacetyl. You don't have to do with that. And then to that same extent, I feel like fungal amylase is one of those that's coming up soon too, for the exact reason that you said. People want a crisp, dry beer that's going to hit that same attenuation, right? That hit a full attenuation that's not going to have any cloying mouthfeel. And so any beer that you want to do that in, and here's an example of a beer that I don't think most people are thinking about it with, but what about like German Pilsner? Right? People aren't necessarily adding fungal amylase to a German Pilsner, but that's a beer that I want to have a crisp, dry finish and fully ferment, right? And it's going to be plenty bitter and plenty clean just from the other additions, but that's a beer that I would love to have crisp and dry, or a Kolsch for that matter, right? Adding fungal amylase to those kinds of styles are beers that I don't hear people adding those enzymes to, but kind of why not, right? It seems like those might be great styles for that.
I think those are two really good examples of styles. I also like to add it for West Coast IPA to continue to dry it out. But on the flip side, like I wouldn't add it in a Helles because you want some mouthfeel and body in a Helles, and the standard attenuation you're going to get from a German lager strain tends to be sufficient. However, you're saying that these can be good problem solvers. What if you miss your mash temp and you're like, oh shoot, I mashed in at 158 or something? I've had that happen where like the temp correction factor was off, and then I double check with a handheld thermometer what it's reading on my temperature screen, and it's like, oh my gosh, it thinks it's 148. It's actually 158. I'll just add enzyme, and it really can smooth over some of these problems that you've created, and then make a normally fermentable wort in a world where you accidentally screwed up your temperature.
Yeah, that's a great example, right? Brewers mess up all the time, and yeah, enzymes can absolutely be used as problem solvers. Man, I think there was a batch that same thing happened to me. I was measuring. I thought I had turned off the burner on the gas tank, but it wasn't. It was just continuing to go. It was continuing to heat up my strike water, and I got my strike water up to like 190 Fahrenheit, right? So that's probably like 95 Celsius. Celsius or like probably like 95 Celsius. And so I was like, well, crap, I can't add this to my mash. But I like just kind of like let it sit. I threw some ice in it and kind of like cooled it down. But the coolest I could get it to was like 185 without just like really dumping ice in it and like really cooling it off. So I just went in with 185 degree Fahrenheit. And I'm sorry, I don't have the Celsius off the top of my head here, but 185. And then, I looked at my mash and my mash was at like 165. And I was like, well, crap, I'm not going to get any fermentation characteristic out of this. And alpha amylase is active at that level. And there is still some beta amylase activity. So I did get like a, I don't know, 55 or 60% conversion, which was terrible, but I did get some beer out of it. But that would have been an excellent example for where I could add that exogenous enzyme if I'd had it on hand. But it's not necessarily something that I would have on hand for that situation if I wasn't using it for another purpose, right? If I didn't have it on hand for like, drying out beers that I want to dry out, it's just something that I wouldn't have. Same thing with like ALDC. If I wasn't using it for, all my IPAs, I wouldn't have it on hand if I had a diacetyl IPA, right? And then be able to use it while it's still in the fermenter to clean some things up while there's still a little yeast and we can still convert that, back into acetylene, that flavorless compound. So it's like part of this is like, that's one of the reasons why I don't carry enzymes or haven't carried enzymes in the past in my stash is because I just think of them as problem solvers, as those like one-off mistakes that I make. And that's really not the way I should think about enzymes at all.
Right. I really encourage home brewers to have, and pro brewers to have this stuff in the fridge, right? Have your ALDC at all times. So you're just, it's really good insurance. It's going to prevent it. Why not? Have your, fungal alpha amylase or some other amylase there. So if you have a mistake, you can fix it, or you can just dry out your beer. And then also the gluco, how do you say that one again? The glucoamylase?
Yeah. Oh shoot. I'm on the spot right now and I'm blanking, but it's like a amyloglucosidase, AMG, right? Amyloglucosidase, something like that. Anyway, good enough.
And that one for if you're making a heavy, adjunct beer, like a lot of wheat or something like that, just like we used to keep rice hulls in our brew house, now we can just keep this enzyme instead.
Yeah, that's a great one too. Like, especially, I like to make a lot of light lagers. I know a lot of home brewers out there aren't really big light lager fans, but if you like light lager and you don't want to have to brew with flaked rice, right, or find flaked corn or corn syrups or any of those things from your homebrew shop, you can brew with rice by using AMG. If you don't have a cereal cooker and you don't have all this extra stuff, that's a great example of something that you can do with enzymes without having to get a cereal cooker or having additional sources for ingredients. Is if you had these enzymes, you could brew with rice. You can make American light lager exactly like, all of the big companies do it by adding enzymes. In fact, I'm pretty sure that most of the giant breweries are using enzymes whenever they're brewing, because they have a wort stream and they're trying to crank as much out of that wort stream as they can so that they can meet production and standards. So I'm sure they're using enzymes for things like rice and corn when they're using those in their beers.
Okay, so you're saying that these pro brewers are probably using AMG when making these beers, and that's to ensure they get proper conversion because, like, the cereal cooker, et cetera, it's just another piece of insurance?
Yeah. Well, no, the cereal cooker was the means for using something like rice or corn, a cheaper available starch, right? That was the means to doing it. But if you don't want to use a cereal cooker, invest in this other additional infrastructure, you can do this. You can make, you can use rice, unmalted grains, corns. Well, maybe not corn. That one has a specific issue that's associated with it, but unmalted grains using these enzymes. Yeah.
And AMG was the one that would achieve that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's AMG, yeah.
Okay, because earlier I was saying that there were three that I keep on me, and it's a different one. It's beta-glucanase. Cellar Science sells it as Glucobuster. And this one is simply for lautering efficiency. And so I do not think that beta-glucanase is going to have any sort of conversion implication when it comes to using unmalted grains like rice or something. Instead, this one is able to basically is a rice hull replacement.
Yeah, it could be, right? So it could have an effect on conversion because that beta glucanase, that's the packing materials, right? So in that present analogy that I was talking about, the packing peanuts and the cardboard and all that stuff, that's beta glucanase. And there's another one called xylans. Beta glucans and xylans are the two things that are in those packing materials, the two main things. There's a bunch of other stuff, but those are the two main ones. So a beta glucanase or a xylanase can be added to get rid of those packing materials. So if you can get rid of the packing materials, you might be able to open up or access more presence in your material. Yeah.
Maybe I'd be able to use this stuff, Glucobuster, to make a beer successfully with unmalted grains.
Yes, that with something like with amylases and potentially an AMG, an amyloglucosidase, and also potentially like a limit dextranase or something else. But the point of that is companies are now selling suites of enzymes that can do that, right? That are like, okay, yeah, here's a suite of enzymes that you can use if you have unmalted grains. Here's what you need. And it kind of takes that thought process out of you, the home brewer, knowing like, okay, which are the specific enzymes I need to use? And we'll talk about that in the next segment in a little bit more detail. But if you can just buy a bottle of like, here's my unmalted grain enzyme mix and use that, then you can access things like anything. You could access, I don't know, it's fall, sweet potatoes or pumpkins, and brew a beer with pumpkin or sweet potato without having to cook it first, right? That's one of those things that you always say is like roast the pumpkin or roast the sweet potato before you put it in the beer. You could maybe potentially ferment with just raw pumpkin or raw sweet potato with this addition of enzymes.
One thing that annoys me about enzymes is we just don't have the same level of prescription on them and diagnostics, I guess, that we have with ingredients when using software like Brewfather, right? Because if it's like in Brewfather, it's like, okay, let me add another pound of my base grain to this recipe I'm working on. Okay, that says it's going to, take it from 1044 OG to 1048 OG or something like that. And you're like, that's a little too much. Take a half pound off. Okay, 1046, I like that. But when you add 1 gram of amylase in Brewfather, it doesn't do anything to the predicted
right.
FG, right? Mm-hmm. And I would assume it doesn't have much to say when you say add 1 dropper of beta glucanase. And, that's not a diss on Brewfather. I don't think Beersmith or, I don't even know if ProMash would care about this stuff, right? And so that's one thing I wish we had is like more calculation surrounding it, because I'm always like, okay, it says add a dropper. I hope that's enough. Or if I add 2 droppers of amylase, is it going to increase the attenuation, or is it like it's already hit its threshold, so it doesn't matter? And so there's so much guessing at the homebrew level when it comes to this stuff that's my one hang up on it.
Oh man, opportunities for experiments there, right? I mean, if you add 3 drops of ALDC versus 1 drop of ALDC, does it do any different, right? Or like you said, amylase. If I've got a something like that and I add some of that amylase enzymes or the beta glucanase, right? Like what if I add a half like 5 drops of beta glucanase versus 1 drop of beta glucanase? Is my efficiency going to go up, or is it going to stay the same? Right? That'd be cool. Those are some fun experiments. I totally agree with you. And I think that there's not really anything that's available at the homebrew level or at the pro level either. I think the only thing that people have in using those enzymes is experience, right? Mm-hmm. And it was one of the things that I talked with Shilpi Halamane about back in episode 107 when we were talking about brewing enzymes and talking about really like traditional uses of enzymes. He had a decade of experience of using enzymes for different applications, working at Widmer and working at the breweries that he worked for. And that's really it. I mean, there's recommendations on the supplier, and let me back up and let me sort of correct myself a little bit here too. You can absolutely call up Simon Carlson or Alexander Mertz, send them an email, and they will absolutely help you, right, with the amount of enzymes that might be useful for your specific application. So there's somebody out there and that's a supplier, right? Novozymes, now Novonesis, is a supplier of enzymes. So if you have those kind of connections, or if you want me to put you in connect with them, I'm sure they'd be happy to help out home brewers that are interested in that stuff. But you're totally right. There's nothing in Beersmith. There's nothing in the softwares that breweries use. It's all just experience. That would be really cool to see. Maybe that's the next, like, the next thing. We've got Brew and Water. Martin Brewingard did that. Or like John Paul Hosum, who did all that work to try to figure out the IBU, right? To have his calculator that dials in all of the different like yeast parameters and fermentation characteristics and all that, so that you hit a measured IBU when you're adding your hop additions. That would be awesome. It's going to take somebody doing that, right? It's going to take a Martin Brewingard or a John Paul Hosum or a Brad Smith or somebody to go out and actually do that research with enzymes to get there. So maybe that's an opportunity. If you're looking for a project as a home brewer, this could be one of those to tackle. All right. Well, it seems like certainly that enzymes could really help brewers expand their capabilities, and that at least we're not reliant totally on the endogenous enzyme package anymore. But we do need to know which specific enzymes to use, and I think it benefits us to go into a little bit more detail about which enzymes do what, so as brewers we can be creative when the time comes, which we will talk about right after this break. More Beer's slogan is absolutely everything for homebrewing, and it's easy to see why, given their selection of over 8,000 products, like the BrewBuild X3 Uniconical Stainless Steel Fermenter, or the Cosmos series of kegerators that give you everything you need to get started with dispensing and serving your homebrew. For quality fermentations, More Beer carries a variety of yeast and nutrients from the likes of Imperial Yeast, White Labs, and Cellar Science. More Beer offers free shipping on most orders over $59, and they also have a killer YouTube channel featuring brewing tips, hijinks, and awesome gear giveaways. Check out everything More Beer has to offer at morebeer.com.
Early holiday deals are here, and so are amazing deals at Amazon. You'll save so much on early holiday gifts for the home, like vacuums, bedding, and home decor. You'll have money left over for that ergonomic recliner to catch up on reading. Or falling asleep while reading. Or that standing mixer to whip up some holiday cookies. Oh, what fun it is to save. Shop early holiday deals now.
Enzymes are everywhere. They're in all living things, and their purpose is to make things easier. Perhaps the best known examples in brewing are the amylase enzymes in malted barley that are active during the mash. But there are tons of other enzymes, and armed with the knowledge of what they do, we can be incredibly creative as brewers. So yeah, Jordan, of course you are familiar with the amylase enzymes that are active during the mash.
It's interesting, this idea that this is a source of creativity, right? Because I've kind of thought about it as a scientific lever, but it kind of is a double-edged sword in that regard, right? And that there's more than one way to skin the cat, and there's more than one way to dry a beer out.
Yeah, exactly. There's more than one way to do it. And there may be different flavor implications, right? So the amylase enzymes and beta-glucanases and stuff and limit dextrinases, that entire enzyme package that is set into the barley by the malting process, we have those enzymes, right? Those are all exogenous enzymes. We have access to those. So I've mentioned earlier, like different starch materials, and I don't want to have to go back into that too much, but that's a great example of creativity, right? I can use any starch material with exogenous enzymes and make a beer with it. That was one of the things that like Alex and Simon were talking about on the show last week. And I thought that was, again, just like, that's kind of mind blowing. That's really a creative use of enzymes, right? It's not just like we said, oh crap, I mashed in too high. I need to cool it down and then add some enzymes so that I can actually get the conversion that I want. That's totally a great use of enzymes, but the creative piece of it comes from the very beginning. Could I do something different? I want to accentuate this flavor in my IPAs. Could I use sorghum to do that? Could I use rice? I want to dry out my IPAs. Could I just, instead of adding dextrose, directly into the kettle, could I add rice and get maybe some different fermentation characteristic, but also still have that crisp, fully fermentable sugar profile? And I don't have a cereal cooker, right? I don't want to have to deal with that, So can I do these things? Can I add rice, like not have to deal with flaked rice, but to make these creative decisions? The Brute IPA, which is the one that Simon talked about, as like, okay, this is really the first time that brewers have embraced enzymes, and they did it to drive attenuation and make a super dry beer at really high carbonation levels, but really, really dry champagne style like IPA. And you did that with enzymes, but that's just one example of creativity using enzymes. That wasn't a style, but for the use of exogenous enzymes.
Well, why don't we get creative here and talk through some different enzymes that maybe we would use in the various parts of the brewing process? And I think maybe we should start with the mash.
Yeah. And of course, like the amylases are the main enzyme that's working during the mash. And so, starch profiles, new starches are a really cool place to start whenever you're looking at amylases. And so I think about all the work that the Scott LaFontaine is doing in rice malt, which is really cool to see how you can access these. And the main takeaway, or one of the main takeaways that he has, is rice is a starch source, but rice contributes more than just fermentable sugars, right? It's not just a sugar source. It actually adds flavor too. And depending on what rice you're using, there's hundreds of different rice styles, right? It's not just like the brown rice or white rice that you get from the store. There's hundreds. There's aromatic rices that are really popular all in, especially in like the East Asian countries that, if we were able to get some of those here or get those into, homebrew stores, they might add some real flavor characteristics, to beer, not just as a starch source, not just to make alcohol, but to actually add flavor to the beer.
Yeah, I think that if we're talking creativity when it comes to ingredients, adjuncts there's such a huge opportunity there. There's things like blue corn or, pink rice, or I don't know. There's all sorts of cool stuff. And I know that there's some flavor implications there. But like we've said, there are some enzymes that can make this job a little easier. So maybe we could break down some of the common mashing enzymes. And I'm going to test your knowledge here a little bit because I don't honestly understand the differences between them that much. So I use fungal alpha amylase in my brew house. But I remember when Brute IPA was a thing that people were recommending glucoamylase, and the glucoamylase would dry the beer out down to like 0 Plato basically, whereas the fungal alpha amylase will only take it down to like 1.5 Plato or so in my experience. And I remember that there was a risk when it came to the glucoamylase of diacetyl production. So my question to you is, what is the differences between these two? Why is one drying the beer out so much and also creating a diacetyl risk? What's going on there?
Yeah, so glucoamylase is also that enzyme amyloglucosidase that we were talking about earlier, AMG, right? And so I think the only difference there is the source of the enzyme. I'm not 100% positive on this, but when you talk about fungal fungal amylase versus like alpha amylase from a barley or beta amylase from a barley, you're talking about its source coming from an organism. So it's coming from a fungus, right? Which yeast is. But there's also other things like Aspergillus niger that makes the clarity ferment enzyme, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that's really all it is. It's an amylase enzyme that's excreted by a member of the fungus kingdom, right? So a living organism that excretes this enzyme, which different than barley. The reason why you would want a fungus to do that is production, because you can think about yeast, right? We use yeast to make beer, and we can produce beer at huge volumes using yeast, right? Without yeast, we wouldn't be able to make beer at huge volumes. It'd be really hard for us to do that by adding just like all the different enzymes that are needed, to go through from glucose to pyruvate to alcohol, to all of that stuff. It would just take forever, right? It would take a really long time for us to do that. Yeast does it on its own, and that's why we use it. And one of the cool things about yeast is we can scale it up to hundreds of billions of cells, and we can get it to take sugar and turn it into alcohol in as little as 2 to 3 days. Hell, even 24 hours, right? So the same thing with another organism that might take use amylases to take things like maltose or maltotriose in its environment and turn it into glucose that it can use in its cell, right? Basically, that's all fungal amylase is doing. It's just that source of the amylase enzymes. Same enzyme, or maybe not exactly the same enzyme, but functionally the same enzyme, doing the same functional aspect. So I don't think there's much of a difference between fungal amylase versus like AMG amyloglucosidase, except that fungal amylase might not be AMG. Fungal amylase might be alpha amylase or beta amylase, right? Alpha amylase and beta amylase are different than AMG, amyloglucosidase. Amyloglucosidase cleaves glucose individually off of starch chains. All right, that's the difference. Beta amylase cleaves maltose. It cleaves two glucose chunks together. Does that make sense? So like beta amylase is not going to chunk off glucose. It's going to chunk off maltose. And alpha amylase is going to just break off huge chunks. It's totally random. It just attaches to a starch. It could be a size 3. It could be glucose. It could be maltose. It could be maltotriose. It could be maltotetrose, maltopentose, maltohextrose, maltoseptose, any of them, right? Up to, a DP of, I don't know, let's say 15 or 20 or something like that, as I understand. DP is, diastatic power. That's the number of glucose molecules that are stuck together. So the alpha amylase is just going to break things off into chunks. Beta amylase is going to break things off into maltose, which is 2 glucose units together. And then AMG is going to break things off into glucose. Now, here's the deal. Yeast loves to ferment glucose. It's the easiest sugar for it to ferment. So if the only thing in the wort is glucose, it's going to eat and consume all of the glucose and be done. Right? So if you've got AMG and it's just chopping off glucose trains, you might actually drive it all the way down lower, right? That amyloglucose or glucoamylase, amyloglucosidase, you might drive that attenuation down. That's the answer to your question. If you just have beta amylase, which might be what you're getting from fungal amylase, it might just be chopping off those maltose. The other thing about beta amylase is it can't attach everywhere that it needs to. So when there's chunks of 3 or 4 or 10, beta amylase can't attach to it and chunk off maltose. Amyloglucosidase might be able to chunk off those individual glucose. So you might have more residual sugars, right? So I don't know if fungal amylase, it contains, wow, that was a really long-winded answer, and I hope it made sense. But essentially the deal there is fungal amylase, fungus means the source of the amylase. Amyloglucosidase chunks off glucose, and then beta and alpha amylase chunk off maltose and then bigger chunks. Okay, I think I can leave it there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a couple follow-up questions then. Does the AMGs of the world, is it converting things into glucose or just increasing the access to glucose?
My understanding is it's actually converting things into glucose.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
so that makes sense then that's why it could dry it out to 0 Plato, right?
Yeah.
If it's turning maltose or maltotriose or whatever into glucose, which is fully fermentable, then there you go. That's why you're getting it all the way down. Whereas the fungal alpha amylase is perhaps just chopping up some of those alpha that aren't as completely fermentable, that we would get normally at a higher temp range, and just making those more fermentable, but still there's still something left behind. That's why we're finishing it more like 1.5 Plato there.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and it is fungal alpha amylase, I guess. I heard you say that. And so, alpha amylase, that's exactly right. It's just producing chunks. And so, some of those are going to be chunks of 2 or 3, which may be fermentable by yeast. Some of them are going to be chunks of 1. I think it can make 1. I'm not actually sure if it can make 1, but I'm pretty sure. Anyway, it's close enough. But you're right. It's going to make chunks that are somewhat fermentable versus AMG, which is going to just chunk off glucose and make it parse off that glucose and make it fully fermentable. Yeah.
So my other follow-up question for you here is, I recall that there was concern that if you add the glucoamylase to the fermenter, that you could get diacetyl production. And I'm curious if you can hypothesize as what the pathway would be there.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on when you added it, right? Because the thing about diacetyl at yeast pitch. Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it also could depend on how that enzyme works, because the yeast are making they're making alpha aceto lactate. All right. And alpha acetolactate, they make that as part of fermenting glucose, right? And so it's a byproduct of the fermentation process of glucose.
Not of maltose.
Well, maltose too, but yeast doesn't actually ferment maltose. It excretes an enzyme called maltase, which breaks maltose down into the two glucose components, which it then takes into the cell and ferments. Actually, I think it can take maltose into the cell too, but anyway, it's using glucose. Glucose is the main product, right? It turns glucose into alcohol, and it does that by chopping the maltose in half and getting 2 units out of it. So it makes alpha-acetolactate, and then alpha-acetolactate gets excreted out of the cell. The thing about it is yeast, that alpha-acetolactate, yeast excretes a enzyme called alpha-acetolactate decarboxylase, ALDC, that chops off the carboxyl unit of alpha-acetolactate and makes diacetyl. Yeast likes diacetyl because it can take the diacetyl back in and use it for other processes in the cell. The issue, and one reason why some yeast cells produce more diacetyl, is they don't produce as much of that ALDC enzyme. So what it does in those cells that excrete off they don't excrete enough alpha-acetolactate decarboxylase. So the alpha-acetolactate gets excreted out, and then it can decarboxylate in solution, just because of chemical reactions that happen in the wort. And then it becomes diacetyl, and that diacetyl just floats around. But it could be far enough away from a yeast cell that a yeast cell isn't able to take up that diacetyl and bring it back in, because there wasn't enough ALDC in solution. If there's a huge amount of ALDC in solution, that ALDC acts on the alpha-acetolactate, decarboxylates it, turns it into diacetyl, and the yeast takes it back up immediately before it gets far away, right? It just goes right back into the yeast cell. So that's the point of adding ALDC, is you increase the frequency with which yeast takes up the diacetyl. It takes it up much faster. It doesn't float away in solution before the yeast can get to it, if that makes sense. So that's where ALDC works. It's interesting, some of these, making diacetyl, using these things earlier in the process, could just be a function of yeast health, maybe yeast not having access to the sugars until they're ready to go back to sleep, or, yeast not being close enough to the sugar sources whenever they're being cleaved, or rather the enzyme continuing to work well past the yeast's lifespan. Right? So the enzyme can continue to yeast or can continue to work and keep cleaving off glucose or maltose or whatever, but the yeast might already be going dormant. So then it hits a glucose, it wakes up, it ferments, creates the diacetyl, but then isn't ready to process the diacetyl. John Palmer gave a good example of maturation when he was saying it's like, you're ready to go. It's 5:00 on Friday. It's 4:45 on Friday. You've cleaned up your desk. You're ready to go home for the weekend. You're all prepared, ready to go. And then your boss comes and sets a huge stack of paperwork down on your desk. And so you just fly through the paperwork, but you don't clean up your desk. You just leave, right? Because it's 5:00 and you got to get home. That's the same thing. That enzyme is continuing to chunk off those little pieces of paper. And so those stacks of paper keep going on your desk, right? And at 5:00, the yeast is done. It's just not going to clean up the diacetyl. So maybe it's because that enzyme is continuing to work and continuing to expose sugars that are fermentable, but the yeast is ready to go to sleep. So that's just totally speculation on my part, and also another really long-winded answer to your question. So I'm sorry.
Well, that's what we get when we talk about enzymes. But when people were making brut IPAs 10 years ago or whatever, I don't know that ALDC was readily available to small craft brewers, or maybe just wasn't well known. Like, surely it wasn't invented in the last 5 years, but it didn't seem like it was like part of the pro brewing conversation 10 years ago like it is today. And I think this really exposes the beauty of blending enzymes, you could add this to your fermenter, this glucoamylase, add the ALDC, and you get the best of both worlds. You get it bone dry without the diacetyl production, because there was concern that if you add it to the mash, you could mitigate the diacetyl production, but you wouldn't guarantee as aggressive of attenuation that you would get if you had added it to the fermenter.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you bring up the brewed IPA, because I definitely had some buttery brewed IPAs, some diacetyl brewed IPAs, and it was like, oh man, I really, okay, sure, a buttery Chardonnay is fine, but we're not talking about a buttery champagne. Nobody really likes buttery champagne.
Keep
mixing
butter out of my beer.
Yeah, exactly. Mixing enzymes is great. And we spent a whole lot of time talking about mash enzymes just now, but there is one more mash enzyme that I think brewers don't pay as much attention to, and that's proteases. Well, you've talked repeatedly, Jordan, about the protein rest and the benefit of the protein rest. There are exogenous enzymes that will do exactly that you could skip the protein rest, but still add in the proteases, to do what you need them to do. You're going to run into, again, temperature issues, but potentially you could add these proteases in that would, allow for improved head retention or fan increase for yeast health and all these other benefits that we've been talking about with the protein rest.
I love foam, and that's really something I really strive for, especially in lagers. But, I think foam even looks good on an IPA or really any style. And, there are certain styles that really struggle with foam, like really strong barrel-aged stouts, also sour beers. So it'd be cool to get access to this at the homebrew level so I could really start playing around with that in beers that are hard to create foam formation and retention, as well as just as a piece of insurance from all my lagers. Do you know, are proteases available for homebrewers?
Yeah, that's one of those. I wasn't able to find an example of a protease that's available to homebrewers. Now, that said, there are quantities that you can buy from the BSG folks and stuff. Lallemand has a pretty cool, they're at least expanding their direct to homebrewer options. So Lallemand has a couple of different enzymes. I didn't see a protease. The other thing too that's kind of difficult is you're not going to see a specific list of the active enzymes in a lot of these mixes, right, that you're going to get from that are available to homebrewers. It's just going to say something like, for example, Brewer's Clarex. Or here's an example. There's an enzyme called Aromazyme from Lallemand, which sounds like it's going to increase the aroma of the beer. And turns out, yeah, it does. It liberates terpene compounds. But how does it do that? I don't know. There's no listing that I could find of the specific enzymes that are in there. Or, what if you're talking about, that the one that you mentioned from Cellar Science, right? That one says it's for beta glucans, but does it also have xylanases in it that are also working on xylans, or are you just working on beta glucans? That'd be a different lautering issue.
It
right?
does mention that actually.
It does? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Does it say it has xylanases in it?
It says beta glucan, it has the beta symbol actually. And then also the X one.
The X one, yeah, the xylanases too, yeah. So yeah, that's cool. So that's one of the examples maybe that tells you, but a lot of these enzymes don't, and so some of them might have proteases in it anyway, right? Just from some additional help. Like if you see an enzyme that says increases free amino nitrogen, that's I'm almost 100% positive that's going to be a protease. Right. So that's a pretty cool one. If you can find one that talks about increasing fan, you might see those in a wine application because wine needs those, right? Wine really suffers for nitrogen because it doesn't have grapes don't have a source of nitrogen like barley does. So you might see a enzyme that you would add to wine that would increase fan, which might also increase head retention in beer in an interesting way. But, then there's like the Clarity Firm enzymes. We've talked about those before on the show. That's the enzyme like Brewer's Clarex or Clarity Firm. It acts on that protein polyphenol complex, which causes haze by getting rid of the protein piece of it. It essentially chops off that sticky proline and makes it not want to form haze. The other thing it does is it makes it gluten reduced. But as Alex mentioned on the show, remember that in the United States, it is gluten reduced. It's probably below that 20 ppm marker, but that doesn't mean it's gluten free or safe for any of your friends that have celiacs or gluten sensitivity. So please don't use something like Brewer's Clarex or Clarity Firm and serve it to someone with gluten sensitivity and tell them that it's gluten free. I'm always going to add that PSA in here just to make sure. The only way to make a true gluten-free beer is to use gluten-free ingredients, and that's according to our gluten-free folks that listen to the show. So I always want to say that. And then I mentioned that Aromazyme enzyme from Lallemand. That one apparently liberates terpene compounds, and you can get it at the homebrew level. You can get it from Lallemand's eShop. And I think it says it's like $30. So if you're interested in increasing hop character in your next IPA, this might be a way to do it. There's also thiol releasing enzymes, beta lyase. We've talked about those in some of the GMO yeast, episodes. Those will increase thiol characteristics. And oh man, that's something we didn't even talk about, Jordan, but GMO yeasts is harnessing enzymes, right? Those yeasts are modified to increase or decrease or remove a specific enzyme. The ones that say that they're diacetyl, the yeasts don't produce diacetyl, that's because they've upregulated that alpha-ketolactate decarboxylase enzyme that the yeast produces, which is awesome. You know, the ones that say that they're thiol producers, they have an increased either beta lyase or, I'm sorry, Laura, if you're listening to this, I don't remember the other enzyme, but those are the whole point, right? GMO yeasts are harnessing the enzyme capacity of yeast, which is really cool. I mean, I just think there's so many creative uses of enzymes, and I wish we could spend another entire podcast talking about it. But I don't know. Like, I don't know about you, Jordan, but this discussion with Simon and Alex and what's coming from it just makes me think that, like, wow, I'm really not using enzymes to the capacity that I should be.
Totally. And there's just new products coming out all the time, you know, like the Clarity Firm is probably the oldest one that homebrewers have had access to that are commonly known at the very least. But then ALDC, it's like everyone's using it now. It's just flying off the shelves in my local homebrew store here in Portland, FH Steinbart. One that I have not gotten to mess around with that I'm really interested in. I don't know if you saw this. They released it maybe a year ago or so. It's this all-in-one series by Fermentus where they're selling yeast enzyme packages. So the enzyme is in the pitch. Mm-hmm. And they've got like a dry one for highly attenuated beers. They've got a few different ones. And like, what a cool idea to just, instead of having to, you know, buy an enzyme and buy a yeast and add them together, just put them in the same package.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, what was it? We talked about Attenuzyme. That's the one that like you add like to hit that attenuation. Yeah, if you had it in the package, like with the yeast, just toss that in, and then you're gonna get that dry repeated character every time. That would be awesome. That's cool. Yeah, I totally forgot to talk about those. That's awesome.
Yeah, there's just so much out there, and as a home brewer, we're really just starting to get our hands on them. I'm really excited for what the future holds with enzymes. I definitely want to do some more experiments on them, and just, you know, things like, is a degree of attenuation the same as a degree of attenuation, right? Like, if we can get to 1006 from sugar versus mashing techniques versus enzyme, does it taste the same? You know? So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions out there that'd be fun to explore.
Yeah, totally. I agree. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I also want to issue a challenge too. So this is what inspired the show last week with Simon and Alex. Simon and I were talking about this in Europe, and we talked about how, we talked about it also at the World Brewing Congress too. But we talked about how it would be really cool if you could make new styles using enzymes, right? And his example was, what if I did 100% rye Imperial Russian Stout, right? I have a challenge to home brewers. If you think of a style that would be really cool to do with any of the enzymes that we mentioned on the show, let us know. Hey, brew a beer with it and see how it works. But let us know and let us, we'll give you our thoughts on what we think and how you could use an enzyme to do it. But that was the whole point of these two podcast episodes, is to just sort of generate creativity. So I'm excited about that, and I'm excited to see what y'all come up with. Anything else you want to add, Jordan?
Yeah, just please reach out to us if you have exciting ideas for enzymes, or if you've brewed any beers using creative applications of enzymes. We'd love to hear what you did and maybe talk about it on the show.
All right, well, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
You have worked so hard to make your business into a reality, but achieving your next business goal, that can be overwhelming. What if you had someone to talk through the options and the next steps with? Someone who wants to see your business succeed while giving you peace of mind. That's why the bankers at Merchants Bank are here, ready with exceptional service every step of the way. Let's dream together. Visit merchantsbank.com to get started. Merchants Bank is a proud member FDIC.